They say the most dangerous moments in life don't arrive with sirens or warnings. They arrive looking completely ordinary. The rain tapped softly against the windows of Miller's Diner, turning Main Street into a blur of silver reflections and neon light. I was wiping down the counter for the third time in 10 minutes, more out of habit than necessity, while the old jukebox in the corner struggled through a country song from 20 years ago. Ashfield, Pennsylvania, wasn't the kind of place where anything extraordinary happened. Our biggest excitement usually came from Friday night football games or the occasional argument at the town council meeting. At 25 years old, I had lived there my entire life. I taught second grade at the elementary school 3 blocks away, volunteered at the church on weekends, and spent most evenings helping my younger brother, Ethan, with homework at the small house we'd inherited from our grandparents. My life wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Predictable. Safe. Outside, thunder rolled across the hills. A few customers glanced toward the windows before returning to their coffee and conversations. The smell of fresh pie and brewed coffee filled the diner, wrapping around everything like a warm blanket. Then the door opened. Not dramatically, not with some grand entrance. Just a quiet chime from the bell above the frame. A woman in her 70s stepped inside, drenched from the storm. Her coat clung to her shoulders, and water dripped from the edge of her umbrella. She took 2 careful steps before her foot slipped on the wet floor. The sound that followed was small, barely noticeable, but I saw it. I dropped the dish towel immediately and rushed forward. "Ma'am, are you okay?" I asked, kneeling beside her. She looked embarrassed more than hurt. "I think so," she said with a nervous laugh. Together, another customer and I helped her to her feet. I guided her to a booth near the heater and brought her a cup of hot tea without charging her. Her hands trembled slightly around the mug. "Thank you, sweetheart," she whispered. "Most people don't stop anymore." I smiled. My grandma would have haunted me if I didn't. The woman laughed. Outside, headlights swept across the diner windows. Then another pair. And another. The reflections stretched across the glass like moving shadows. A convoy of black SUVs rolled slowly down Main Street. Every vehicle spotless despite the storm. Every window tinted dark enough to hide whoever sat inside. It was the kind of thing that didn't belong in Ashfield. A few customers noticed. Conversations faded. Even the waitress beside me paused mid-step. Something about those vehicles felt different. Important. The lead SUV slowed as it passed the diner. For a brief second, I caught a glimpse through the windshield. Just a man sitting in the back seat. Dark hair. Sharp features. Eyes fixed directly on me. Not the diner. Not the street. Me. The feeling lasted less than a heartbeat. Then the convoy continued through town and disappeared into the rain. I should have forgotten about it. I almost did. But later that night, nearly 50 miles away, Damien Moretti looked away from the storm-covered highway and asked a single question that would change both of our lives forever. Who is she? Sometimes the smallest questions become the ones that refuse to leave you alone. I did not know any of that when I woke up the next morning to the sound of Ethan arguing with the toaster. The smell of burnt bread drifted through our little house before I even opened my eyes. I rolled over, checked the clock, and groaned. 6:32. Saturday. My one day to sleep in. "Claire," Ethan shouted from downstairs. "I think it is broken again." I laughed despite myself and pulled a pillow over my head. "It is not broken. You just keep putting bagels in it." 10 minutes later, I was standing in the kitchen, rescuing another unfortunate breakfast while my 17-year-old brother pretended none of it was his fault. Outside, sunlight pushed through the clouds left behind by the storm. The streets of Ashfield looked exactly the way they always did. Quiet. Familiar. Safe. By 8 o'clock, I was walking toward the farmer's market downtown carrying a canvas tote bag and a list of groceries. The air smelled like wet pavement and fresh-cut grass. People waved as they passed. Mrs. Dawson from the bookstore. Coach Miller from the high school. A dozen familiar faces. That was life in a town like Ashfield. Everybody knew everybody, which was why I immediately noticed the stranger. He sat alone outside the coffee shop across the street. Dark coat. Expensive watch. Perfect posture. The kind of man who looked completely out of place among pickup trucks and family-owned stores. At first I barely paid attention. Tourists occasionally passed through town. Then I noticed his eyes. Gray-blue. Calm. Focused. Watching. Not in a creepy way. Not in a threatening way. just observing everything around him with unusual intensity. When our eyes met for half a second, he looked away and lifted a coffee cup to his lips. Strange. I continued walking. By noon I had forgotten about him. Until I saw him again. This time near the hardware store. Standing beside a black SUV. Talking quietly to another man in a suit. My steps slowed. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe not. Either way, something felt unusual. The second man handed him a folder. The stranger glanced through it before looking toward Main Street. Toward the elementary school where I worked. A strange chill ran through me despite the warm afternoon. I told myself I was imagining things. People did business everywhere. Not every man in a suit was suspicious. By late afternoon, I was helping Ethan clean out the garage when my phone buzzed. It was Mrs. Dawson. "You will never believe this," she said immediately. "There are businessmen all over town asking questions." I laughed. "Questions about what?" "About you." My hand froze around a cardboard box. "What?" "Nothing bad." They were polite. They asked where you worked, whether you had always lived here. Basic things. It was odd. The chill returned. Stronger this time. Did they say why? No. Just smiled and thanked me. After the call ended, I stood there staring at my phone. Across town, 50 miles away in a private office overlooking the Philadelphia skyline, Damian Moretti closed a file containing every detail of my life. My address, my job, my family, my routines. Then he leaned back in his chair and stared at my photograph for a long moment before quietly saying something that made every person in the room exchange nervous glances. "Clear my schedule next week. I am going back to Ashfield." The funny thing about small towns is that secrets rarely survive for long, but strangers stand out immediately. 3 days after Mrs. Dawson's phone call, I started noticing things I could not explain. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would make sense if I tried to describe it out loud. Just little details that lingered in the back of my mind. A black SUV parked across from the elementary school when classes ended. A man in a tailored coat reading a newspaper outside the diner during lunch rush. A familiar gray-blue gaze appearing in different places at different times. Every time I spotted him, he was alone, calm, watching the world like it was a puzzle only he understood. On Thursday afternoon, I was leaving school with a stack of student art projects balanced against my chest when I saw him again. He stood near a flower shop on Main Street. The same man from the coffee shop. The same man from the hardware store parking lot. This time he was holding a paper cup and looking toward the school entrance. The moment our eyes met, he smiled politely. Not the confident smile of someone trying to impress a woman. More like someone who had finally confirmed something important. I looked away first. That evening, I convinced myself I was being ridiculous. Maybe he was a developer interested in buying property. Maybe he had family nearby. Maybe there was a perfectly normal explanation for everything. Unfortunately, my imagination disagreed. By Friday night, even Ethan noticed. We were carrying groceries from my car when he nodded toward the end of the street. That is the third time I have seen that SUV this week. My stomach tightened. "You are imagining things." "No, I am not." He squinted. "Actually, I think somebody is sitting inside." I refused to look. "Ethan." "What?" "Stop watching random people." He laughed and grabbed 2 grocery bags. "You are the one acting nervous." Maybe he was right. Because later that night, while rain tapped softly against the windows again, I found myself standing in the living room staring outside. The street was empty. No vehicles. No strangers. Nothing unusual at all. Yet I still felt watched. The feeling followed me into the weekend. Then Saturday morning arrived. The annual Ashfield Community Fair filled the town square with food stands, live music, and enough homemade desserts to feed half the county. It was my favorite event every year. Familiar faces. Familiar conversations. Familiar traditions. Exactly the kind of place where life felt simple. I was helping children paint wooden birdhouses when a hush moved through part of the crowd. Not fear. Curiosity. The kind that spreads when someone important unexpectedly appears. I glanced up, and there he was. The stranger. Standing near the fountain in a dark navy coat that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. People moved around him naturally, but somehow he seemed separate from everyone else. Like he belonged to a different world entirely. For several seconds, neither of us looked away. Then something unexpected happened. He started walking toward me. My pulse quickened. 1 step. 2. 3. The distance between us disappeared faster than I wanted. Finally, he stopped in front of my booth and looked down at one of the birdhouses painted bright yellow by a 7-year-old student. "That one might be the happiest building in town," he said. His voice was calm, deep, surprisingly warm. I stared at him for a moment before finding my voice. "Then it probably has lower property taxes than the rest of us." For the first time, I saw a genuine amusement flash across his face. And something told me this conversation was about to change everything. For a second, I thought I had imagined the smile. Not because it was dramatic. Quite the opposite. It was small, genuine, unexpected. The kind of smile that transformed a face you had only ever seen looking serious. Around us, children ran between booths carrying balloons and cotton candy. Music drifted from a temporary stage near the courthouse. The scent of barbecue and kettle corn floated through the warm afternoon air. Yet somehow all of that faded into the background. "That was a pretty good answer," the stranger said. "Most people would have thanked me for the compliment." I folded my arms. Most people do not stare at elementary schools all week. His eyebrow lifted slightly. "You noticed? You were not exactly subtle." For the first time, he actually laughed. The sound surprised me. It was quieter than I expected. Less intimidating. More human. "That is fair." I narrowed my eyes. "Are you going to tell me why you are here?" He glanced around the crowded fairgrounds before looking back at me. "Business. What kind of business brings someone to Ashfield for a week?" "The complicated kind." That answer earned an immediate eye roll. "Very helpful." His smile widened. "I try." Before I could respond, one of my students tugged on my sleeve. "Miss Bennett, look." A little girl proudly held up a birdhouse covered in crooked pink hearts. I crouched beside her and admired every single one. By the time I stood again, the stranger was watching me with that same focused expression I had noticed before. Not judging, not distracted, just paying attention. Somehow that felt more unsettling. "You really like your job," he said. "I love it. Even with the long hours?" I blinked. "How do you know the hours are long?" A brief pause. Too brief. "Teachers always work more than people think." The answer sounded reasonable, yet something about it felt rehearsed. Before I could press further, a voice called his name from somewhere behind him. "Mr. Moretti." Both of us turned. A tall man in a dark suit approached quickly, stopping a respectful distance away. The stranger's expression changed immediately. Not colder, just more controlled, more careful. The easy humor disappeared behind something sharper. "I need a minute," he said to the man. The man nodded and stepped back without argument. My stomach tightened. Nobody in Ashfield dressed like that. Nobody called someone Mr. Moretti with that level of respect. The stranger looked back at me. "Claire Bennett." Hearing my full name made me freeze. He noticed. "You know who I am." It was not a question. "I know who you are now. And before today." His gaze held mine for several seconds. Then he gave a small shrug. I was curious. "About me?" "Yes." The honesty caught me completely off guard. Most people would have lied. He did not. The fair suddenly felt louder. The music harsher. The conversations around us more distant. "That is a little strange," I admitted. "I have been told that before." Another smile appeared, brief and almost reluctant. Then the man in the suit returned and quietly handed him a phone. Damien Moretti glanced at the screen. Whatever he saw erased every trace of amusement. He slipped the phone into his pocket and looked at me one last time. I should go. Relief and disappointment arrived at exactly the same moment. "Good luck with your complicated business." His eyes softened slightly. "Something tells me I am going to need it." Then he turned and walked away. I watched him cross the fairgrounds until he disappeared into the crowd. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, I found a folded note tucked beneath one of the painted birdhouses. There were only 6 words written on the paper. "We should have dinner sometime, Claire." I stared at the note for a full minute before crumpling it in my hand. Not because I was angry, because I had no idea what to do with it. The fair was closing around me. Vendors packed away decorations. Children chased each other through the fading evening light. Somewhere in the distance, a country band finished its final song. Yet all I could think about were 6 simple words. "We should have dinner sometime, Claire." Ethan found me standing beside the booth 10 minutes later. "You look like somebody just told you aliens landed in town." I slipped the note into my pocket. Nothing happened. That is exactly what people say when something happened. I rolled my eyes and started carrying supplies toward my truck. The problem was that something had happened. Damien Moretti had somehow become impossible to ignore. The stranger who kept appearing around town. The man who seemed to know things he should not know. The man whose presence made me simultaneously curious and cautious. By the time I got home, I had convinced myself to forget about the note completely. Then Sunday morning arrived. Church ended around 11. Families gathered outside exchanging hugs and weekend plans. I was halfway down the front steps when I noticed a familiar black SUV parked across the street. My stomach immediately tightened. The vehicle remained still. The windows were dark. Yet somehow I knew exactly who was inside. I tried to ignore it. I lasted almost 20 seconds. Finally, I crossed the street. The passenger window lowered before I reached the curb. Damien sat inside wearing a charcoal gray jacket and an expression that suggested he had expected me to come over eventually. "You have a strange habit of appearing everywhere," I said. "I could say the same about you. I live here." Fair point. Despite myself, I almost smiled. He stepped out of the SUV. Up close, he looked even more out of place than before. Not because he was overdressed, because he carried himself differently. Calm, controlled, like nothing around him could ever surprise him. "Did you read my note?" he asked. I did, and I think it is a little ridiculous. His eyebrow lifted. Dinner is ridiculous? No. Leaving mysterious notes under birdhouses is ridiculous. To my surprise, he laughed again. There it was. That same brief warmth I had seen at the fair. "I will remember that next time." There should not be a next time. The words came out sharper than I intended. For the first time, silence settled between us. Not awkward, just honest. Damien looked toward the church across the street. Families, children, familiar faces. A completely different world from his own. "You do not trust me," he said quietly. "Should I?" His gaze returned to mine. For a second, something unreadable flickered across his expression. Not annoyance, not arrogance, something closer to disappointment. "Probably not," he admitted. The honesty caught me off guard again. Most people spent their lives trying to look better than they were. Damien seemed strangely comfortable telling the truth. Before I could respond, my phone rang. I glanced at the screen and immediately felt my heart drop. The local medical center. Ethan had a cardiology appointment scheduled that week. Calls from doctors never came unexpectedly for good reasons. I answered quickly. By the time the conversation ended, all the color had drained from my face. Damien noticed immediately. "Claire." I lowered the phone slowly. The specialist wanted to see us first thing Monday morning. And suddenly, for the first time in months, I was terrified of what they were going to say. Fear has a way of making time move differently. The 24 hours between that phone call and Ethan's appointment felt longer than the previous 6 months combined. I barely slept Sunday night. Every creak of the house sounded louder. Every thought felt heavier. By 6 in the morning, I was already sitting in the kitchen nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold half an hour earlier. Ethan shuffled into the room wearing a faded sweatshirt and gave me a tired smile. "You know staring at coffee does not make it stronger, right?" I tried to smile back. "I am working on a new scientific theory." He laughed, and for a moment, everything felt normal again. That was the hardest part, looking at him and pretending I was not worried. The drive to the medical center took 20 minutes. Rain drifted across the windshield in soft gray waves. Neither of us talked much. The radio played quietly in the background while my mind raced through every possible outcome. By the time we arrived, my hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles hurt. The waiting room smelled like disinfectant and fresh coffee. Families sat quietly flipping through magazines or staring at their phones. I checked the clock every 30 seconds. Finally, a nurse called Ethan's name. The next hour felt endless. Tests, questions, more waiting. When the cardiologist finally entered the consultation room, I knew immediately that something had changed. Not worse, just different. He sat down carefully and folded his hands. "The condition is stable," he said. I closed my eyes in relief so quickly it almost made me dizzy. Stable. The word felt like sunlight after a storm. Then he continued. There was a treatment option. A promising one. New specialists. Additional evaluations. More appointments. More costs. The relief lasted exactly 3 seconds before reality returned. I already knew what advanced medical care looked like. I already knew what insurance did. Not cover. Numbers started forming in my head before he even finished speaking. Numbers that felt impossible. By the time we left the medical center, Ethan seemed hopeful. I was doing math. The dangerous kind. The kind people do when they are trying to figure out how many jobs one person can realistically work. We stopped at a diner outside town before heading home. Ethan disappeared toward the restroom while I sat alone in a booth pretending to read a menu. My phone buzzed. Unknown number. Normally, I would have ignored it. Instead, I answered. Claire. The sound of Damien's voice instantly pulled me from my thoughts. How did you get this number? I asked. You are asking the wrong question. I leaned back in my seat. Then what is the right question? A brief silence followed. How is your brother? My grip tightened around the phone. For several seconds I could not speak. I had told almost no one about the appointment. Yet somehow he knew. Not just about Ethan. About today. About everything. Outside the diner window, rain slid slowly down the glass. Inside, my heart started beating faster. Who exactly are you, Damien? I asked quietly. For the first time since I had met him, he did not answer immediately. The silence on the other end of the line lasted just long enough to make me regret asking the question. Around me, dishes clinked softly inside the diner. A waitress carried a tray past my booth. Rain continued sliding down the windows in slow silver streaks. Everything looked normal. Everything sounded normal. Yet suddenly nothing felt normal anymore. I am someone who pays attention, Damien finally said. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was such an absurd understatement. People who pay attention do not know about private medical appointments. Another pause. You are right. His honesty disarmed me again. It always did. Most people would have invented an excuse. Damien never seemed interested in excuses. Then explain it. Not over the phone. My frustration grew immediately. Convenient. Necessary. The calm certainty in his voice only irritated me more. Before I could respond, Ethan returned carrying 2 sodas. I lowered the phone slightly. I have to go. Claire. Something in his tone made me hesitate. What? Do not spend tonight worrying about money. I froze. My heart skipped. Once again he had somehow reached directly into the thought I had not spoken aloud. How do you keep doing that? I asked quietly. But the line had already gone dead. The drive home felt longer than usual. Ethan talked about school, baseball, and the possibility of finally getting cleared for more physical activity if future evaluations went well. I listened, smiled when appropriate, encouraged him whenever I could. Inside, however, my thoughts kept circling back to Damien. By the time we pulled into the driveway, dusk had settled across Ashfield. Warm yellow lights glowed from neighboring houses. Sprinklers clicked rhythmically across freshly cut lawns. The entire street looked peaceful, familiar, safe. Yet something felt different. The moment I stepped inside, I noticed an envelope resting on the kitchen table. No stamp, no address, just my name written neatly across the front. Claire. My stomach tightened immediately. Ethan picked it up first. That is weird. Very weird. I opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Nothing dramatic. No threats. No mysterious messages. Just contact information for a medical specialist in Philadelphia. A highly respected cardiac expert whose name I recognized immediately from Ethan's treatment research. At the bottom of the page was a handwritten note. If you decide to call, tell them I sent you. DM. I stared at the paper for several seconds. Then several more. Ethan looked over my shoulder. Who is DM? I folded the note before he could read anything else. Nobody important. The lies sounded weak even to me. That night, I sat alone on the back porch long after Ethan went to bed. Crickets sang from the trees. The air smelled faintly of rain and summer grass. Above me, hundreds of stars scattered across the sky. My phone rested beside me on the wooden railing. 3 times I picked it up. 3 times I put it back down. Finally, just before midnight, headlights appeared at the end of the road. A black SUV rolled slowly past the house without stopping, without honking, without drawing attention. It continued down the street and disappeared into the darkness. Yet for the briefest moment, as it passed beneath a street lamp, I caught a glimpse of the man sitting inside. And somehow I knew he had not driven by to check on the neighborhood. He had driven by to check on me. The next morning, I called the specialist. I told myself I was only gathering information. Nothing more. The woman who answered the phone was polite, professional, and surprisingly enthusiastic the moment she heard the doctor's name from the note. Within 15 minutes, she had scheduled a consultation that normally carried a waiting list measured in months. When the call ended, I sat motionless at my kitchen table staring at the wall. Something about it felt impossible. People like me waited. We filled out forms. We called insurance companies. We sat on hold for hours listening to terrible music. Doors did not simply open, yet somehow one had. The rest of the week passed in a blur of lesson plans, student projects, and medical paperwork. Outwardly, life looked exactly the same. Inside, everything felt different. Every time my phone buzzed, I wondered if it was Damien. Every time I saw a black SUV, my pulse reacted before my brain could catch up. Then Friday afternoon arrived. The final school bell echoed through the hallways. Children rushed toward freedom. Teachers exchanged exhausted smiles. I was gathering papers from my desk when a shadow appeared in the classroom doorway. My heart immediately recognized him before my eyes did. Damien stood there holding a small paper bag from Miller's Diner. "You cannot keep appearing like this," I said. "I was invited." "By who?" He nodded toward the front office. "Your principal." That explained absolutely nothing and somehow made the situation even stranger. I walked toward him. Do principals normally invite mysterious businessmen into elementary schools? Only the charming ones. I sighed. "You think you are funny." "Occasionally." The paper bag shifted in his hand. "You skipped lunch." My eyebrows rose. "You know that too?" The diner owner mentioned it. I accepted the bag before I could stop. Myself. The smell of a turkey sandwich drifted upward. My favorite order. Exactly the way I liked it. That realization should have concerned me. Instead, it made me unexpectedly emotional. Not because of the sandwich, because someone had noticed. Life had become a constant cycle of taking care of everyone else. Ethan, my students, my responsibilities. Somewhere along the way, nobody had really taken care of me. Damien watched my expression carefully. "You look tired." "I am tired." "You do not have to carry everything alone." The words hit harder than they should have. I looked away first. Outside the classroom windows, late afternoon sunlight stretched across the playground. Children laughed in the distance. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence felt strangely comfortable. Finally, I turned back toward him. "Why are you doing this?" The question came out softer than before. Not angry, not suspicious, just honest. Damien studied me for several seconds. His usual confidence faded slightly. For the first time since meeting him, he looked uncertain, human, vulnerable. "Because every time I tell myself to leave Ashfield," he said quietly, "I find another reason to stay." My breath caught. Not because of the words themselves, because of the way he said them. Like they surprised him too. Then his phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen. The warmth in his eyes disappeared instantly, replaced by that familiar controlled expression. Whatever world Damien belonged to had just reached back for him. He slipped the phone into his pocket and looked at me one last time. "I have to go." Something about the way he said it made my stomach tighten. As he turned toward the door, I suddenly realized I did not want him to leave. After Damien left the classroom, the silence felt strangely loud. I stood alone among colorful posters and tiny desks, staring at the doorway he had disappeared through. Outside, the last buses pulled away from the curb. The playground emptied. The school settled into the quiet rhythm of late afternoon. Yet my thoughts refused to settle. Over the next few days, I did not hear from him. No phone calls. No notes. No unexpected appearances. At first I told myself it was a relief. Then I realized I kept checking my phone anyway. Thursday arrived with clear skies and the first hints of fall in the air. Ethan and I drove to Philadelphia for the consultation with the specialist. The building overlooked the city skyline, all glass and steel and polished floors. Everything about it felt expensive, important, intimidating. The appointment lasted nearly 2 hours. Tests were reviewed. Options were discussed. For the first time in years, a path forward seemed possible. Not easy, not guaranteed, but possible. When the doctor finished, he smiled warmly and shook Ethan's hand. "You have every reason to be hopeful." I thought I might cry right there in the office. As we left the building, Ethan stopped walking and looked at me. "You know this happened because of him, right?" I pretended not to understand. "What happened?" "This appointment." He gave me a knowing look. "The mysterious guy." I laughed despite myself. "You watch too many movies." "Maybe." He smiled. "But I think he cares about you." The words stayed with me all afternoon. Later that evening, as we returned to Ashfield, I noticed a familiar black SUV parked beside the lake outside town. My pulse quickened instantly. I pulled over before I could talk myself out of it. Damien stood near the water, hands in his coat pockets, watching the sunset paint the surface gold and orange. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The breeze carried the scent of pine trees and distant wood smoke. Finally, I walked closer. You disappeared. His eyes met mine. I had things to handle. Important things? Not as important as this. The answer came so quickly that I knew he had not planned it. Somehow that made it more meaningful. We stood side by side looking across the lake. The silence felt different now. Comfortable. Familiar. Like something fragile had finally stopped fighting to exist. The appointment went well, I said quietly. Relief softened his expression. Real relief. Good. You knew it would. He smiled faintly. I hoped. The sun continued sinking below the horizon. Shadows stretched across the shoreline. For the first time since meeting him, I understood something important. Damien Moretti was not fascinated by my world because it was exciting. He was fascinated by it because it was real. Simple dinners, school events, family, community. The things most people took for granted were the things he looked at with quiet wonder. After a long silence, he turned toward me. I spent most of my life chasing bigger things, he said. More success, more power, more control. His gaze held mine. Then I came to Ashfield. My heart beat faster. And a small smile appeared. The same genuine smile I had seen only a handful of times. And I met a teacher who reminded me what actually matters. The last light of day reflected across the water as I looked at the man beside me and realized something had changed in both of us. Maybe some people arrive in your life to rescue you. Maybe others arrive so you can rescue each other.